Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to Recall This Story, a conjuring trick that resurrects the short fiction of the past by tapping the undimmed vitality of the present. Writers become revenants whose words come alive on the lips of their latter-day successors or admirers. And Sylvia Townsend Warner, I think, may have no greater pair of admirers than me, John Plotz of Recall This Book, hello, and my guest today, Ivan Kreilkamp of Indiana University, editor of Victorian Studies, author of many wonderful books, 2 on Victorian literature, and more recently, a gem about Jennifer Egan, A Visit from the Goon Squad reread. So welcome, Ivan, Sylvia Townsend Warner lover. Great to have you back on Recall This Book.
Thanks, John. Yeah, great to be here.
So today we present you Sylvia Townsend Warner, The Revenant. She's an amazing writer, hard to sum up, from, like, for example, her early satire of colonialism and missionaries, Mr. Fortune's Maggot, in 1927, her barbed feminist exploration or allegory about selling your soul to the devil, Lolly Willows, which is from 1926, and Ivan, you had a really wonderful piece about that one, through deservedly canonized novels like her French Revolution novel, Summer Will Show, from 1936, and her Chronicle of Life, in fact, conceived, I recently learned, as a Marxist-Leninist chronicle of life in 12th and 13th century convents, The Corner That Held Them, 1948. And Ivan, maybe we could discuss this, but I actually see that book as an inspiration for, among other later writers, Hilary Mantel. Like, it has this resolutely dual register of distant verisimilitude, like historical accuracy, plus utter psychological modernity, and maybe a through line for today, a modernist prose plain style. It's really an amazing novel. So Warner lived from 1893 to 1978, and she's celebrated for a multitude of things. For example, her mid-1930s collaboration in various genres with her then partner Valentine Ackland. Do you know if that's not how you say her name?
I'm not sure, actually. That sounds
Yeah.
right.
Okay, so we'll go with Ackland, but Acland anyway. Her range of realist short fiction, her biography of T.H. White. I think there was a biography of Jane Austen too that maybe was never published. Her cat stories. But I think maybe one of the strangest of her forays came late in life, but possibly arising from her friendship with the New Yorker editor William Maxwell, which is a series of fairy stories that were published together as a volume in 77, just before her death, Kingdoms of Elfin. Fairy, I guess, is immediately a problematic word to describe them because these two are modernist plain style stories, and the elves and the fairies they describe, who live in moldering or decrepit or out of the way castles and burrows and forgotten domains, are not entirely fantastical creatures. They're more like ordinary consciousness, ordinary human-seeming consciousness, thrown into circumstances that strike us humans as quite extraordinary and magical. They're winged, they lived for centuries, but to them, this is simply the humdrum, ordinary existence of their often banal lives. They get trapped in church belfries, they fall in love with sexually ambiguous human beings, they adopt and then cultivate and then neglect little sort of human lovers or catamites with names like Ib and Bello. So I'm making them sound less grand and weird than they are, but I think any kind of description would do that. The stories have to be read to be understood. And in fact, reading them recently in the original New Yorker context, alongside, worried editorials about Watergate and cartoons about the rise of political junk mail, I was struck again by how out of place and out of time they must have seemed like in the late 1970s as Warner, at the very end of a long life, turned to this utterly strange kind of bywater. So I think they're perfect for a Recall This Story intervention. And we're going to bring you today, Ivan's Choice is not the final story to appear in print. It came out in 1975, and the last of them were published in 1977. But the one that Warner chose, and kind of the last editorial act of her life, I think, to appear as the last in the volume publication, and it's called Foxcastle. Before we get there, though, Ivan, you wanted to sort of talk us through Warner a little bit, especially thinking about the stories that appear in Kingdoms of Elfin, and then, but maybe I wanted to invite you to start by, giving your own account of, what drew you here to the end of Warner's career.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Warner's. I think you actually first recommended Lolly Willows to me. I think I've read all her novels except for The True Heart. I haven't gotten to that one yet. But
Oh,
I
cool.
mean, one thing that's remarkable about her, and I assume is part of the reason I think she's still kind of underrated and not known as well as she should be, is that pretty much each one of her books is kind of freestanding, eccentric, in a quite different mode. I mean, it's sort of hard to, uh, certainly very difficult to categorize her work in terms of any kind of school or anything like that. The Flint Anchor is sort of that's from 1954, sort of a neo-Victorian novel. That one's great. You already talked about The Corner That Held Them. That's completely remarkable. Summer Will Show is about the 1848 revolutions in Paris, very political. Lolly Willows is sort of this witch story. We can connect Lolly Willows to the fairy stories, but she's just, and I think the Hilary Mantel comparison is really apt. I mean, she's very interested in, some of her books are historical fictions, and even when
And
they're not,
Ivan, thanks for correcting me about Summer Will Show, by the way, which I hadn't read. So it's not the French Revolution; it's 1848.
oh,
Right?
sorry, I
Yeah,
missed that you had said,
yeah. No, I
it's
appreciate that. Yeah,
1848, yep.
yeah.
Yeah, so I think the Hilary Mantel comparison is spot on, and I think part of that is that she's very interested in other minds and sometimes in a particular historical context, but she's just interested in the mystery of other minds and the deep strangeness of other people. And she often returns to, I mean, I guess Mr. Fortune's Maggot is maybe the clearest example of this, where it's literally a sort of explorer's ethnographic missionary tale. But a lot of her situations involve people put into new surprising situations where they have to understand a new context, and she's very interested in dramatizing these kinds of culture clashes or conflicts of perspective. And the fairy stories are just a remarkable late career explosion of creativity. Yeah, I mean, as you said, it's just incredibly weird to imagine reading these while Nixon's resigning and so on. I mean, they seem so out of time, and they're definitely kind of fey and weird, but also just really astringent and sharp and sometimes rather cruel.
Yeah, the
And
cruelty, the way that she sits with cruelty, I think is great. I mean, there's a lot of cruelty that characters perform on one another, but her own sort of chilliness about it is really notable. And I think that's true of The Corner That Held Them, too, which really is so sympathetic to its inhabitants of the convents, and yet, is willing to just see them die and pass out of the story kind of almost without remark.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
There's this early line in the first story, the one and the other.
yeah,
Elfheim strikes cold at first. There's sort of
yeah,
this chilliness,
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah,
many of the stories involve human beings who are sort of suddenly brought into this elfin world,
yeah,
and find it, depending, quite fascinating and alluring, entrancing, but sometimes extremely cold, and
yeah.
it certainly can be quite cruel.
And that's also true. I mean, we've talked about this before, Ivan, but like some of my favorite ones often are the moments when the elves or fairies try to move out into the human world. So the one I was referring to about the belfry, it's Elfinor and Weasel.
Oh yeah, that's a
Yeah.
great one.
Which are right. Weasel is such a good name for a fairy, but they end up actually getting killed literally by a church bell, like by the banging of the church bell. And so there's this way in which if we're struck by the coldness of their world, they're kind of overwhelmed by the too muchness of our world. Like we're so, in a way, I don't know, in a way, the humans are Americans here, and and the fairies are like retiring British people. Like human activity is so loud and disruptive and carnal and icky, and then the human Yeah, and so when fairies
But
get
some,
immersed in that world, they get kind of
yeah, and some of the fairies like it. I mean, they generally find it sort of vulgar and,
yeah,
troubling and embarrassing. But once in a while, they like it quite a bit. Like
yeah,
there's a fairy, and it's in that same story, Elfinor and Weasel. Uh, she says about him, he would never be able to go back to the fairy world. He did not want to. There was better entertainment in the mortal world. Mortals packed more variety into their brief lives. There was
right.
always something going on. And
Yeah. Right. So that brings up actually, that's something that's interesting. That's something we've talked about a lot on Mercalda's book. Like when we had Madeline Miller on to talk about her novel, we talked about that way that the humans must seem to gods. Like that's such an interesting question. Like, we mortals invent the notion of immortal or long-lived races because that fills some kind of desire that we have for like something other than an ephemeral existence. But then you turn it around and ask, well, if those beings actually did exist, what would they find appealing about us? Um, but Ivan, just to pick up on that point about the strangeness of the different worlds, I totally take your point that that is a feature of Warner's realist fiction as well. Like she's always interested in how people are strangers. Not only are they strangers to us because they're live at some historical remove, but they're kind of strangers to one another. But I actually did follow the lead of a David Trotter article about the posthuman in Warner, and I read something she wrote called the Cat's Cradle book. Have you read this?
oh
Yeah.
no, I haven't read that one. Yeah,
Yeah, so it's
it's
from the 1940s. I never would have found it if it weren't for the excellent Trotter article. But it is stories putatively handed down by cats, but they're actually not mostly about cats. They're mostly about human beings, but they're like the cat's eye perspective. And early on, there's sort of two narrators, a sort of cat lover, and then someone who comes to meet the cat lover. And the cat lover says to the narrator, try to clear your mind of humanism. And I feel like that might be the mantra for Warner, like that, not that there isn't a human perspective, but just try to clear your mind of having only a human perspective and think about what a different perspective might also be.
Yeah, and the fairies have these rituals that they sometimes call inhumanization
Hmm.
for it's almost like inoculating or vaccinating the humans they capture
Oh,
often,
wow.
like the baby in the first story goes through this whole week of ceremonies. Every day, a fasting weasel bites the child's neck and drinks its blood for 3 minutes.
Yeah.
The weasels are then weighed before and after the drinking, and a distillation of dew, soot, and aconite is added. And then by the eighth day, it is sufficiently inhumanized.
Yeah.
So they're never completely inhumanized, and they can't live as long as fairies, but
Right.
they then are they do live a bit longer.
Yeah.
So yeah, the story we're going to read, Foxcastle, is as you said, unusually human focused, and it's about a fairy lover who, um, well, no spoilers.
Yeah, no spoilers.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
That
see,
sounds
see how
good.
it goes.
So it appeared, it's basically the Christmas issue of the New Yorker. It's December 15th, 1975. So, it appeared, in the run up to the Carter Ford election, I guess. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
few years after Exile on Main Street. Yeah, it's just
Yeah.
a weird moment for these stories to.
And actually, Cody, one more context that maybe we can come back to. I was looking up when alien abduction stories started to become popular in the US, and the first alien abduction stories are like from actually the 1950s, but then in the 60s, you get tons of alien abduction stories. So we could think about, what it means to be kidnapped by space aliens and what kind of abduction story this is by contrast.
Yeah, yeah, they are very much like a race of aliens.
Yeah.
So should I go ahead and
Yep.
read it?
Bring it
Okay.
on. It's great.
So this is the last story in the collection. It's called Foxcastle. He could not imagine in what way he had offended them. Ever since he could remember, they had fascinated him. His nurse sang him to sleep with ballads about them. He pursued the hinds and shepherds on his father's estate for stories of how they danced round the Cronach Loch, of the pebbles aimed by invisible hands that skipped over its surface in games of duck and drake, of how on a sudden they would leave altogether, whirring their wings and whistling, how they stole butter from Mungo's mother's churn, hated sluttishness, danced rings into the grass, how, wearing mourning scarves, they were seen following the crazy minister's bier to the grave, how it was impossible for them to weep, how they must never be mentioned on a Good Friday, how wary one must be not to offend them by pulling as much as a dead bough for fuel from a thorn tree. When he was sent to the University of Aberdeen and could get at books, he read everything he could find on their subject, that they were the scattered remains of Satan's host, were a superstition, were the old Picts. In reading the English poets, a fanciful lot, that they slept in cast snakeskins, drank from acorn cup goblets, sat on mushrooms, drove teams of mice. Grounded on ballads and folklore, he discounted most of this, except as evidence substantiating their existence, since to be dismissed as a superstition proves a preliminary belief. Time went on, he took his degree as M.A. and was appointed to the lectureship in rhetoric. The learned life suited James Sutherland so well that he was careful not to jeopardize his hold on it by mentioning his private opinions. Yet sometimes they broke from him, as when in a disputation with the professor of history, a fanatic for the Picts, he found himself being an apologist for the kingdom of Elfin, and thereafter was spoken of behind his back as Fairy Sutherland. During the summer vacation, when many of the scholars went home to help get in the harvest, the professor of history traveled about in search of Pictish remains, the likeliest sites for them being the so-called fairy nose, which proved conclusively that fairies were imperfectly remembered Picts. The lecturer in rhetoric also traveled about for his own purposes, and was not above examining Pictish remains, in case they afforded a small footprint or a strain of harp music. If, as sometimes happened, the two men met, they conversed on blameless subjects, such as the prevalence of horseflies or the clear atmosphere which presages rain, and parted. But in his 49th summer, James Sutherland had Foxcastle to himself. One might say it came to him as a reward of faith. A visiting lecturer in jurisprudence had remarked that, whether or no fairies existed, they influenced leaseholds. The legendary Tyned to Hell, which bound fairies to offer a living sacrifice every 7 years, making many tenants unwilling to begin a 7-year lease, or a lease of multiple sevens. On the off chance of finding a fairy legally recorded, James Sutherland used to buy bundles of old law papers off the scrivener's stall in the market. Nothing came of it till the day he saw the name Foxcastle in a disputed ownership of a sheepwalk in Peebleshire. Foxcastle, Folks' Castle. The meaning jumped to the eye. It was a long journey to make on foot, but if it had been as far as the Indies, he would have made it. Foxcastle was a hill among other hills, steep-sided, flattened at the top. If it had been a sheepwalk, that must be long since, for the heather had taken over, covering the summit and lapping down the sides. It was heather of long-established growth, standing over knee-high on thickened stems. As he was forcing his way through it, he thought that the professor of history would be hard put to it to trace any Pictish remains. He was still relishing the thought when he fell into a pit. He got into a formation of peat hags, which started up from the heather like foes from an ambush. The stagnant water streaking between them reflected the sky with a savage blue. He scrambled out, none the worse except for wet feet and a twisted ankle, and with a sharpened appreciation of the nature of moorland peat, dry as a bone above, wet as corruption below. Walking more cautiously, he skirted the peat hags, and sat down on the western slope to shake the water out of his shoes and rub his ankle. He had never felt so imperially alone. In all the wide expanse around him, there was no sign of man. Nothing moved except a few sheep on the opposite hillside, and the burn flickering and rattling down the valley between. He watched a hawk flying in wide, surveying circles overhead, saw it gather its flight into a poise, and strike down on its kill. It was as though this imposed an edict of silence, not a small bird uttered. After a while, he saw it lift nonchalantly away. It was its own hawk, but manned hawks must often rise over Foxcastle. Fairies were known to go hawking, using merlins, he supposed, to bring down larks. A merlin would be proportionate. Angus the shepherd, who had seen a fairy, said it was a head taller than the tallest thistle, portly, and holding itself very stately and erect. So much for sleeping in a snake's castweed. But poets always spin nonsense out of reality, piling Pelion on Asa for a giant, whitening a lady's hand to new fallen snow. There is considerable variance about the elfin complexion, authentic reports ranging from pallor to gypsy swarthiness. The fairies who came out of a hill in Suffolk were green. Other authorities held that they are invisible to mortal eyes, or only to be seen at dusk, when colors would be muted. Angus had seen his thistle fairy at dusk. James Sutherland rubbed the ache from his ankle. His shoes were dry. He put them on, but did not get up. There was still a good stretch of the long summer afternoon to run. The sheep on the opposite hillside had not begun to move upward to their sleeping place. With every movement, the rich, drowsy scent of the heather intensified. He would stay a while longer. When he woke, it was night. Clouds had gathered, blotting out moon and stars. It was cold. The heather had lost its scent. He lay unmoving to husband his warmth. Later he woke again. It was still murk night, and so silent that he could hear, as though it were close at hand, the burn in the valley. Lulled by its unresting voice, he fell profoundly asleep. A fingernail pricked him awake. The heather was gone. The clouded sky was a shadowy stone vault. He lay on a stone floor and was bound hand and foot in swathings of cobweb, so elastic that when he moved they yielded, so tough that they would not let go. The fingernail explored the convolutions of his ear, left it, traced the lines on his cheek. Other hands were fingering him, lightly, delicately, adroitly. His shoes were taken off, his toes parted, the soles of his feet prodded. His coat was unbuttoned, his shirt opened. Fingers tweaked the hair in his armpits. The watch was pulled from his fob pocket. He knew they would not stop at that. Cobweb bonds yielded as he writhed and struggled, and each time he thought he had snapped them, they tightened again. The explorers waited till he lay exhausted, replaced the watch, and proceeded methodically to his genitals. Not once had they inflicted the slightest pain, except to his feelings. He did not even know when they left him, only that they were gone. He lay in his cobweb bonds and wept. For these were fairies, these silent, invisible tormentors. Throughout his life they had been his dearest preoccupation. He had believed in them, venerated them, championed them. How had he offended them? Why were they so ungrateful? A bowl of milk and some sponge fingers appeared beside him. "Wash your hands first." The speaker was invisible. The voice was unmistakably that of a servant of position. He was propelled towards a jet of water which cascaded from a hole in the wall, brimmed a rocky basin, and vanished with a gurgle. He implored the speaker to appear, asked why he was made captive, thanked for the milk. He was speaking to the empty air. The jet of water splashed, gurgled, and went its way. While his back was turned, a truss of dry fern had been spread out beside the milk. It smelled of sun and the outer world. The milk, too, was restorative, the sponge fingers so exquisitely light that they melted in his mouth. A sense of purpose returned to him. He must wind his watch. He pulled it out. It had stopped. Till that moment, he had been perplexed or angry or cut to the heart. But he had not felt intimidated. It had been too story-like for that. Now he fell into the blankness of despair. He was lost. His watch, sole ally of his irrational man, had stopped. He sat with its accustomed weight on his hand and looked at its dead face. An expedient of fear, disguised as common sense, sneaked into his mind. It would be possible to set it going again, its hands adjusted to a conjectural position. The conjecture need not be far out, and in any case he would be sure of a measure of time. With an odd scruple of honor, he buried the dead watch in his pocket. Presently they came back again, or were back again. He was stripped of his clothes, his wig was pulled off, he was again propelled to the jet of water and washed. The water cascaded over his head and shoulders. Soapsuds exploded in his ears and stung his eyes. There must have been half a dozen of them at work on him, hissing as though they were grooming a horse, and tut-tutting at the dirt ingrained on his knees and elbows. When they had washed and dried him, they cut his nails, cleaned his teeth, and handed him his clothes. The clothes smelled rancid. He was averse to putting them on, but did so because he was chilled. He was also very hungry. No food appeared. Instead, there came a new relay of fingerers, who stripped him once more and began to measure him. He felt the tape slipped around him, laid along him. The hope that he was being measured for new clothes was unfounded. He was being measured from motives of biological curiosity, the length of his nose, the span of his nostrils, the girth of each toe, the exact position in relation to spine and thigh bone of the mole in his buttock, the dimensions of the callus on his pen finger. They also took his pulse and counted his teeth. After this, he thought, they will cut me open and anatomize me. But when they had finished their measurements and repeated some in order to be sure of them, they were gone, silently as they had come, silently as they had been throughout their leisurely, meticulous investigation. Then came a bowl of soup, bread, cheese, and bullace plums. After that, how long after, he had no watch to tell him, came nightfall. In the darkness, he was woken by the sound of a desperate voice, a shout of despair which had broken from him in a dream, re-echoing from the vault overhead. He recognized it and heard it die away. He had renounced chronometry. It was not so easy to renounce habit. From habit, he continued to pull out his watch and consult its dead face. Each time, he said to himself, I won't do that again. But he went on doing it. For how long, he could not have said, but certainly for several months. For the fern they brought him for his bedding had lost any smell of the warm, summered earth. He judged by the hollowness of the wind and the lessening of the mysterious daylight, which came and went in the windowless gallery where he lay like the flow and ebb of a tide, that it must be well past Martinmas. By now his absence from the faculty would have been remarked on, one or another of his pupils accounting for it by saying that he had been stolen by the fairies. The hypothesis would have come to the ears of the professor of history, who would have poured reason on it. Legend supplants reason. In days to come, there would be a tradition that a lecturer in rhetoric at the University of Aberdeen had been stolen by the fairies, as indeed he had been. It was easier to speculate on what was going on in the outer world than on his own circumstances. He saw his food appear. There was never enough of it. He heard the wind blowing. He heard the water splash into the rocky basin with an unchanging voice. He felt himself washed and saw every fragment of litter, every crumb and cobweb, removed by invisible hands and de facto becoming invisible. His attendants, he'd come to think of them as such, had a Presbyterian zealotry for cleanliness. His beard was cultivated daily. He had never thought to have a beard. Only beggars and peasants were bearded. He supposed it was let grow as a badge of captivity. It was combed and trimmed and anointed with oils like Aaron's. In a moment of curiosity, he pulled out a hair. He was swarthy, but the hair was bright red. He grew attached to his beard. It replaced the mouse or the spiders, which ameliorate the lot of ordinary prisoners. But it was reaped off, and after that they kept him clean-shaven. At lengthening intervals he was measured, but now a little perfunctorily. Before long they would lose interest, and there would be no more visits. Whatever they had in mind, entertainment, the pursuit of knowledge, the pleasure of being busied about something, they had intended him no harm, no good. It was impersonal, the traffic of water flowing over a stone. And one day, when they were finished with him, he felt a pat on his shoulder. It intended him no harm, no good, and it almost destroyed him. It was as if he were falling apart with happiness. For the first time, a fairy hand had rested on him with the wastefulness of a caress. He froze, he burned, he was immortally awake, he was overwhelmingly sleepy. He experienced all the vicissitudes of love simultaneously. Even when he had dwindled down to his ordinary self, his mind had been jolted to a different tilt and took a different retrospect. If he had offended them and so put himself in their power, they had shown a more moderate resentment, imposing nothing worse than solitude, which he had always preferred to company, in cobweb fetters. They had washed him, fed him, bedded him in a comfortable thickness of fern. Their hands had always been gentle. Where was the farm animal who could say that of a mortal master? Why had he wasted all these months in being unappreciative? He detached his fetters, coiled them up, laid them in a corner, and walked easily to the door. As he expected, it was locked. Remembering his mortal weight, he put his shoulder to the door and forced it open. Behind rose a winding stairway, its steps very shallow. He mounted it, rising into gradual warmth and light, hearing the splash and gurgle of water sounding on in its solitude. The stair ended in an anteroom where two fairies were playing Beggar My Neighbor, as intently as though crowns and kingdoms depended on it. He stood for a while, watching the fall of the cards. They were the same as any other cards, but smaller and more brightly painted. These were the first fairies he had ever seen. He saw them without surprise or particular elation. The fortune of the game wound and unwound, governed by the chance of a card. The fortune of his game had brought him fairies. but he'd always known fairies were in the pack. He walked into the adjoining room. It was a large room, lit and scented with bayberry candles, and an assembly of fairies moved about in it, moving with such small gliding steps that they seemed to melt rather than move. Angus was not far from the mark, taller than a tall thistle, he had said. Well-grown thistles on the family estate must have reached a good 4 foot. He could remember them overtopping him when he was a child, and how majestically they fell when his father slashed them. He stationed himself in a recess to be out of the way and undisturbed by being noticed. One is always disconcerted by the ease with which foreigners talk their native tongue. The speech he heard resembled no civilized mortal language. Slurred and full of hushed hisses, it was more like some dialect of Gaelic. But though he listened, hoping to catch a word which would put him on the track of what they were talking about, all he knew was that some proposal had been made and accepted. They gathered into a circle, sat down on the floor, and began to sing, softly clapping their hands to mark the measure. It was a wandering melody, a melody of no enterprise, but it must have had some charm for them, and the words, perhaps, some rustic association. For why else should these well-dressed persons sit in a ring on the floor, like peasants in a hayfield? Or were they rehearsing a masque? He had got the tune by heart and learned nothing of the words when there was a brisk tooting of trumpets. All rose to their feet. In came the trumpeters, 2 children, bright as parakeets in their gold-laced uniforms. The queen followed. She was small, not taller than her trumpeters, cat-faced, and carried a knitting bag on her arm. She acknowledged her court by a ceremonious, inattentive curtsy, and beckoned to a fairy who was obviously a person of importance. He hurried forward, bowing deeply, and knelt before her, holding out his hands. She looped a skein of wool over them, wound it into a ball, dropped another curtsy, more of a bob this time, and withdrew, followed by her trumpeters, whose gold-laced demeanor contrasted with her air of modest simplicity. He was still smiling over the trumpeters when another music began, a sort of Turkish march, played by 2 fiddlers and a drummer. By degrees, everyone was dancing. Here a minuet, there a reel, there a prancing hornpipe. It seemed they danced as the fancy took them, with little regard to the music, till with a rap on the drum it quickened and commanded them into a circle that gathered and dispersed, faster and faster, whirling by like swallows. He watched till he could watch no more. In the anteroom, the match of Beggar My Neighbor was still going on. Burrowing into his fern bed, he told himself he must remember all this. He awoke hearing an airy scuffle overhead. His attendants were flying up and down the gallery, contesting for a pair of stockings. It was gratifying to see them at last, though embarrassing to know he had been in the charge of these flippant young persons. He coughed. They descended looking as grave as tombstone cherubim. When he glanced round for his clothes, they held out new ones. The measuring had certainly not been for these. Everything was too large. The shirt pouted, the sad green suit would have fitted a Hercules. As for the stockings, they were so inordinately long that they had to be rolled 6 times before they could be gartered. He was not a vain man, or luxurious, but he esteemed his legs, and wore silk stockings. These were woolen, and the word that came to his mind was Pictish. It struck him that just as the English poets underestimated the size of fairies, fairies overestimated the size of mortals. The reflection was philosophic and soothed him, but not entirely. The theory of pockets had defeated the Foxcastle tailor, so he had to hang his watch on a ribbon round his neck and tuck it into the bosom of his shirt, like a loyal Jacobite locket. From an outer worldly point of view, his attendant's goodwill was a trifle hail fellow, but he was grateful for it. They were fairies, visible and well-disposed, who might be useful as teachers of their native tongue, and they had the merit of being reliably available. When he went upstairs into good society, it was disconcerting to find himself alone, as he often did. Accustomed to a methodical social order where time is respected and persons occupy the portion of space where you expect to find them, he reconciled himself to the vagaries of Foxcastle by seeing it as an exemplification of the fait ce que voudra of Thelem. What would next be wished and when, and for how long, and by how many, was unforeseeable. They were fickle in their loves and hates, fickle and passionate in their pursuits. Some devoted themselves to astronomy. Others practiced the French horn. Others educated squirrels. Some, he presumed, made measurements. Only one thing was certain: they never quarreled. Even in their fickle hates, they hated without malice. Whisking from one pursuit to the next, they never collided. The best comparison he could draw from the outer world was the swarm of mayflies, indivisibly borne aloft, lowering, shifting, veering, like a shaken, impermeable gauze veil over the face of a stream. Somewhere beneath her court, the Queen of Foxcastle sat in her private apartments and knitted. Fais ce que voudras. She was devoted to knitting and never tired of it. When his attendants told him this, and that if she had no more wool at hand, she unraveled her work and knitted it up again, he exclaimed, "Penelope!" But of course they had never heard of Penelope. Though by now he had learned enough Elfin to be able to converse in it, and was considering a treatise of Elfin grammar, he found it difficult to acclimatize himself to a society which had not a vestige of mortal scholarship, except in mathematics. The stargazers astonished him by the dexterity of their calculations, looking at him blankly the while if he spoke of Orion or Cygnus. His previous researches into fairies had not prepared him for this divergence between their values and his. They had a practical knowledge of the world. They also knew it was round, but that was the extent of their knowledge. They knew nothing of its ancient history and celebrated characters, and did not care to. They had no more than a loose hearsay acquaintance with their own history, and were satisfied to be without any written record of it, since they attached no importance to what might be learned from a book, and were amused by the mortal dependence on pen and paper. It was this that blighted his project of the Elfin grammar. They were not unfriendly to it, and when he explained the laboriousness of inscribing it on tables of stone, another illusion lost on them, a party of working fairies was dispatched to steal a load of paper, while others compounded ink and collected goose quills. But the grammar was never written, because the load of paper was stolen from a cooked meat shop, and consisted of a manuscript cantata soaked in grease. It was also disconcerting when a fairy he was talking to became invisible. But the overruling disconcertingness was to find himself unconcerned. It was as if some mysterious oil had been introduced into the workings of his mind. If a thought irked him, he thought of something else. If a project miscarried, a flooding serenity swept him beyond it. He lived a tranquil truant, dissociated from himself as though by a slight agreeable fever, such a fever as one might catch by smelling a flower. This happy state had begun when he stood watching the game of Beggar My Neighbor, and became aware that the players didn't notice him, that his large, obtrusive mortality made him in some way invisible to them, invisible in that they did not connect with him, felt no obligation to do so. In his former life, he lived in a balancing act between obligations. He had an obligation to do such and such. He had no obligation to do the other. He performed the obligation, and the best he was likely to get out of it was the thought that it was done with for the time being. He omitted the non-obligation, and was lucky to get off without a kick from his conscience. He had never conceived of the total release of not being an obligation himself. Day after day, month after month, went by, and not once did he see a fairy's face clouded with a look of obligation. Whether they conversed with him, praised his pronunciation, said how much better he looked without his wig, it had eventually fallen to pieces. Whether they vanished, leaving him halfway through a sentence, their motives were pure as the heavens. They had done as they wished. But why, feeling no obligation towards him, had they plucked him from the heather and added him to their establishment? And why, if he were to be added, did they hide from him and keep him a prisoner, to make him desolate, then change his desolation to happiness? Such a motive, stern and sentimental, might obtain in Aberdeen, but not under Foxcastle. To be useful? But he was useless. To be informative? At the least breath of information, they melted into air. To be a trophy? Of all his speculations, this was the only one he paused at. A despot of the Renaissance, his court swarming with poets and philosophers, experts on Plotinus, sumptuous harlots, bishops, boys, artists and artificers, inventors, assassins, dancers on the tightrope, had fixed his ambitions on owning a giraffe. He had forgotten which despot. The learning he had brought from the outer world was moldering from disuse. Only legends and trivia like the giraffe remained. What happened to his wig might well be happening to the compartmented order inside his skull. In his blessed condition of being nobody's obligation, he could spend his intellect as he pleased, sometimes thinking, sometimes observing, coming to conclusions, and unripping them for the pleasure of knitting a new one from the same material, as the Queen did. It was as though he had always lived at Foxcastle, accepting his good fortune without surprise, as the fairies accepted him, and endlessly fascinated by their unaccountableness. The more he studied them, the more baffled he became. It was not that they were mysterious. They were as straightforward as the scent of a rose, as a wasp's sting. It was impossible to love them. They were too inconsistent to be loved. It was unavoidable not to be drawn to them. And they defied conjecture by taking themselves for granted. Theologically identified as the scattered remnants of Satan's hosts, rationally dismissed as superstition, they were a race of pragmatists. Just as they were content to know next to nothing of their own history because they were living in the present, they took Foxcastle for granted because it was their dwelling place. Yet how was it that living inside a solid, sizable hill, he could hear the wind blowing and recognize from what quarter it blew? How could he know day from darkness, with all that bulk of earth between him and the sun? When he questioned his attendants, they looked blankly at him, blankly at each other, and said the bayberry candles were regularly lit at sundown. When he asked the leading fiddler, who enjoyed conversation and had never made himself invisible, he was told rabbit holes. And by degrees he gave up the problem and was grateful for the light that drifted in like a mist and need not be accounted for. Whenever the fairies trooped off on a raiding excursion into the outer world, he wandered about the halls and corridors of Foxcastle, almost and never quite familiarizing himself with its layout. For instance, he never discovered how the fairies quitted it. Quit it they certainly did, since they came back with spoils. Perhaps they used some watery stair. The hill was veined with springs. Some were trapped for the water supply, others only existed as murmuring voices at a distance. When he was left alone, he could hear them quite plainly. But this was only possible when he was alone. The raiders came back. The silence was painted by their gay, glittering voices. They were extremely hungry. They had tricked all the mortals they had met. Fingering his watch, that old harmless acquaintance, he sat listening to their brag and admired the faithful traditionalism with which they recounted exploits well known to him before ever he had met a fairy. Mungo's mother gaping into her churn, the elf bolt spanged off an invisible thumb that knocked the peddler senseless as he made off with his load of thorn tree wood. The girl laid on her back in the green wood. Bird Janet was one of the ballads he had fallen asleep to, but Janet's babe had been fathered by Tam Lin, who was a stolen mortal like himself, and so uneasy lest at the end of his 7 years in fairyland he should be picked as the tend to hell, that he invoked the girl to lie in wait and snatch him out of the queen's retinue. He himself was safe from such a rescue, since no one in the outer world had loved him enough to snatch him back to it. Falling into dreamless sleep in his bed of fern, waking to the splash and gurgle of the running water, opening his eyes to the brooding dusk of the stone roof, it was inconceivable that he had lain there unreconciled and heard his shout of despair re-echoing from the vault overhead. A fuss about nothing, a midge-bite madness, a fit of the tantrums. For by the simple act of discarding his fetters and walking up a winding stair, he had attained the wish of his heart. Watching these happy beings for whom weeping was impossible, he had become incapable of grief. Watching their inconsistencies, he had become incapable of knowing right from wrong. Disregarded by them, he had become incapable of disappointment. Alone or in their company, listening to music or to silence, he lived in a perpetual present, like the queen with her knitting, each stitch the stitch of the moment. It was her custom to appear every evening and knit publicly, as she had done the first time he saw her. He had then supposed that the business of the skein of wool wound off the supporting hands of a kneeling courtier was a formality of etiquette, like his approaching bows and the tooting trumpeters. Afterward, he learned that it was a signal mark of favor and rarely bestowed. Like all etiquettes, it was thought slightly funny and viewed with great respect. On the evening when she beckoned to him, he was so far from expecting it that he had to be nudged by a stander-by before he realized what was happening. Remembering to bow and feeling painfully aware of his disproportionate size, he made the long journey towards her and crouched at her feet, holding out his hands like a suppliant. Out of her knitting bag, she drew a ball of wool and 2 needles. "Attend," she said. "This concerns you. I cast on 7 stitches, 2 plain, 2 purl, 2 plain, 1 purl, and reverse. 1 plain, 2 purl, 2 plain, 2 purl, and reverse. 2 plain, 2 purl, 2 plain." She knitted slowly and firmly. Already he saw the rib emerging. "And 1 purl, and break off." She bit through the thread. A squadron of flying fairies swooped down, seized hold of him, bore him up and away. He was shoved and squeezed through a twisting crevice into the outer world. A couple of sheep took fright and galloped off, their hoofs drumming on the shallow turf. The hill had been fired. Nothing remained of the heather except a few charred stumps. He would not have known where he was except for the peat hags and the hurrying burn in the valley. He watched the blood congeal on his leg, and his consciousness wandered over his body from one ache to another. The aches were specific. They corresponded with the bruises, the scratches, the punctures of being forced through an exit much too narrow for him. But there was a further ache, an underlying discomfort which corresponded with nothing and existed totally, an ache of weariness, of bodily mistrust. Castellum, a fortified enclosure. It was a mortal voice, the voice of a person of culture. He sprang up and almost fell over. His legs were tottering. He had lost his sense of balance. He had become an old man. The speaker was quite close. He was dressed in black. He wore a voluminous white neckcloth. He carried a most peculiar hat in a gloved hand. He'd spoken to a group of ladies who were even more oddly dressed than he, wearing white shifts down to the ground. Their waists were under their arms. The shifts fluttered in the wind and showed the shape of their legs. A couple of young men made up the party. They too had waists under their arms and a general resemblance to clothes pegs, but all these were mortals. He staggered towards them, making noises. He had lived so long with the fairies, he had forgotten his native speech. He could only gibber and stammer. When they turned to look at him, he realized that he was in rags and half naked. The ladies started back. The young men stepped forward defensively. "Do not be alarmed. Do not be alarmed. He is merely one of our half-wits, too common in these days. Poor unfortunate creatures, allowed to stray about for their living, but harmless. Our country people call them innocents. Leave me to deal with him." He turned to James Sutherland. "Go away, my poor fellow. Here is a guinea to buy yourself better clothing before the winter finds you out." The ladies were making a little collection amongst themselves. Now one came forward with it, her eyes averted. He stared at her. Words were coming back to him. Take it," said the gentleman. "Go away and be grateful."
Thanks, that was amazing. We should say fais ce que voudras means just do what you want.
The story is definitely, I mean, really all of these stories are kind of experiments in just a fundamentally different ethical system.
They're very into etiquette. They have their own norms. They're like, I was thinking about the analogy of being like mayflies, which I think is an incredibly old, I bet it's in Homer even, comparing human lives to flies. And part of the point is, oh, it's just incomprehensible. But maybe in this context, it isn't that it's incomprehensible or that it's trivial. It's that it's like it's done according to a different economy. Like they do actually, like mayfly motion over a stream actually has some kind of sense to it. It's just unavailable to humans.
I love the sentences. Watching these happy beings for whom weeping was impossible, he had become incapable of grief.
Yeah.
Watching their inconsistencies, he had become incapable of knowing right from wrong.
Yeah.
Disregarded by them, he had become incapable of disappointment. He
Yeah.
lived in a perpetual present. So it's one of those moments, there are many of them throughout the stories, where a human being is somewhat inhumanized, is to some degree brought
Yeah.
into this very way of being, but it never can fully take. And so, for example, watching these happy beings for whom weeping was impossible, he had become incapable of grief. I don't really take that as him becoming happy the way they are. It's sort of like he's lost the capacity for grief, but he doesn't really get their capacity for for that special kind of fairy satisfaction.
Right.
It's a troubling in between position.
Yeah, and at one point, I mean, the word impersonal comes up, I think, a couple of times. It was impersonal, that he tries to tell himself he should be more grateful than, like he said, farm animals don't get treated as well by their owners as I'd been treated, and I should be happy for that. But it's just impersonal.
Yeah.
Can I connect that to the point? So the David Trotter article about Warner and the posthuman fixes, I think, rather literally on the non-human in terms of animals and in terms of machines. And I feel like when we think about posthumanism nowadays, it's really easy to think about like the human relationship to what Donna Haraway calls the cyborg, or humans. And you do animal studies, so you think about the human relationship. You wrote a wonderful book about the Victorian relationship to pets. Um, but so I guess the question is just kind of simple-minded, is like where do fairies or the elf world fit in that world of like the post-human or the non-human? Like it's one thing to write about cats, like Ursula Le Guin wrote a lot of cat stories, and you're just like plainly outside of the human. But when you write about these invented worlds, like well documented historical worlds of fairies and elves, is that a kind of post-humanism too?
Um, yeah, I think I can see thinking of it in that frame. And your analogy to alien abduction stories makes sense to me as well. I mean, these do seem a little bit like uh, some kind of science fiction scenario where there's a race of beings who
Yeah.
are not completely inhuman, but at certain moments you're reminded that they lack they lack certain human ways of thinking or ways of
Yeah.
being. I mean, it's complicated by the fact that they share the Earth, so they have
Yeah.
a similar relationship to certain natural forces and
Right.
so on.
Do you know there's
Um,
this Randall Jarrell poem, All I Never Thought of, Think of Me? That was probably published in the New Yorker too. But it's a kid who wants aliens to come and take them to be his pet. So like that idea of having an outside. Like I totally get your point, which is that like the beyond of the fairies is ultimately really unsatisfying. Like there's this poignant desire. Like the history professor is well grounded, right? Because everything can be explained as Pictish custom. But Fairy Sutherland is caught chasing this will-o'-the-wisp, and he gets it, and it turns out to not care about him in the slightest.
yeah,
But there is something poignant about actually like achieving a beyond, like getting extra human. Yeah.
yeah. I There's a great line from an interview with Warner where about the fairy stories, where she says, "I suddenly looked around in my career, and remember, of course, when she started writing these stories, she was 70 years old.
I think so. She's born in
Yeah,
1893, so yeah, probably.
yeah, at least,
Yeah.
yeah. I suddenly looked around in my career and thought, good God, I've been understanding the human heart for all these decades. Bother the human heart. I'm tired
Yeah.
of the human race. I
Yeah.
want to write about something entirely different."
Yeah.
So it is very much, and again, like
Yeah, it is post-humanism, right? I mean, it's like don't be like in the cat stories, which are from the 1930s, you just rid yourself of humanism. That's
yeah,
yeah.
but then it also you know, as you suggested with your comparison to Hilary Mantel, it has something to do with the impulse of historical fiction.
Whisking from one pursuit to the next, they never collided. The best comparison he could draw from the outer world was the swarm of mayflies, indivisibly borne aloft, lowering, shifting, veering like a shaken, impermeable gauze veil over the face of a stream. So they're there. I mean, they're there, they're acting. You actually can form some conjectures about their acting. It's not pointless to try, but you're also aware that you're just like you're reaching out over an incredible distance at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah, and I do feel that way sometimes with our cat.
Yeah.
Sort of like
Yeah.
we share the same space.
Yeah.
Like we can,
Yeah.
it, he seems friendly to us in some respects, but you
Yeah.
also kind of realize like he is just a completely different set of values and way of looking at the
Yeah.
world. And at
Yeah.
times you suspect that he would kill you or let you die, or
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
he
That's
means
why
no
I
harm, no good.
Yeah, that's why I have incredible respect for that strange English guy. I can't remember the name of the book, but you know this guy who set out to try to live like different animals just physically? Like he like a badger, like he built himself a mast so that he couldn't see up and he would only go
No,
out in the night. And he
I don't
just
think I know that.
yeah, it's a great book because it's just like very earnest. It's completely nerdy. It's mostly about the devices that you need in order to feel like how a rabbit felt or yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I really, I respect that notion that part of it is probably completely impalpable and you'll never get there, and other parts you maybe could fabricate it. What Warner's really interested in is the notion that like we can comprehend like godlike or animal impulses in our own world. And I think there's a long tradition of the realist novel which says we can comprehend what it's like to have animal desires or godlike desires because humans have some version of those. But Warner, I think from really early on, is interested in the idea that they you know, there's non-human desires too. There's things that are just beyond us, and they're going on around us all the time. Like, I was really struck that she's really good friends with David Garnett, who wrote Lady and Fox, who's a
Mm.
creepy guy, but an amazing writer. Both Man in the Zoo and Lady and Fox are really strange books about, treating the human as something other than human. And I took out from the library a book of their correspondence, which I'm looking forward to diving into. Um, but do you know what I mean? Like, in other words, things don't always have to be humanized. Sometimes you do just have, you just have to respect that there's like something, going back to your point about your cat, Ivan. I mean, like, there's things going on in our world which they don't clock.
Yeah, they often observe human beings with a sort of either a completely cold eye or sometimes with a desire to be entertained. Um, Aquilon is observing two peasants as he stood watching them with a naturalist's unimpassioned interest in some familiar variety of the lesser creation.
Ivan, thank you so much. This has been another amazing Recall This Story. And for people who enjoyed it, we have Linda Schlossberg talking about Alice Munro, and we started off with Steve Macaulay talking about John Cheever. So I think we have a pattern of mid 20th century short story writers published in the New Yorker.
Yeah.
We might need to break out of that. Would love to hear your suggestions for future episodes. But in any case, Ivan, thank you so much. People should check out your Jennifer Egan book and your other writing. You have lots of public writing as well. It's a great pleasure. And yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much, John. This was tons of fun, and always happy to steer a few people in Sylvia Townsend Warner's direction.
Yeah.
Just don't get stuck in fairyland.
Yeah, seriously. Stay out of the barrows after dark. Definitely.
Yeah, you might
If you
get
feel like
dissected
taking a
or
nap
something.
by the peat hags, don't.
Yeah.
Okay.
Get home
All right.
after dark. Okay, thanks,
Okay.
John.
Take care. Bye. Recall This Book is the creation of John Plotz and Elizabeth Ferry. Sound editing is by Kamaya Bagla, and music comes from a song by Eric Chaslow and Barbara Cassidy. We gratefully acknowledge support from Brandeis University and its Mandel Center for the Humanities. We always want to hear from you with your comments, criticisms, or suggestions for future episodes. Finally, if you enjoyed today's show, please forward it to 5 people or write a review and rate us wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.